The stench of the scrap zone was thick that night, the air heavy with the rust of dead machines and the soft hiss of wind slipping through twisted metal. The man moved through the piles of broken parts like he always did, head down, boots crunching through shattered glass and wet ash. It was supposed to be just another night of scavenging. One more evening in the endless routine of surviving on the edges of a world the Galactic Council had long forgotten. But then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the graveyard of machines. A low, shaky breath. He froze, scanning the dark between the heaps of old hull plating, and then he saw it. Curled beneath the wing of a crushed shuttle was a girl, small, filthy, bruised, her pale skin faintly glowing beneath the grime. Her hair shimmered faintly like threads of starlight, and when her eyes opened, they burned silver in the night. She wasn't human, and she was terrified. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world around them was silent, except for the soft creak of the wind shifting the scrap. She tried to push herself up, but she was too weak. Her clothes were torn, her hands shaking. She looked like someone who had been thrown away like broken tech. He had seen alien parts in this place before, machines, drones, wrecked exoshells, but never someone alive. He should have walked away. The council would have executed any human caught harboring an unregistered alien. But something in the way she looked at him, desperate but not begging, froze that instinct. She wasn't a threat. She was a survivor, and humans had always known what it meant to be abandoned. He wrapped her in an old thermal cloak and carried her out of the trash heap. She weighed less than he expected, almost fragile. But she clung to his shirt as if she was holding on to the last bit of the universe that hadn't betrayed her. He didn't speak as they walked through the fog back to his shelter on the outskirts of the colony. Words weren't needed. She didn't trust him yet, and he didn't trust anything. But somewhere between the rust and the cold, a decision had been made. He was going to protect her. In the days that followed, she barely spoke. She didn't understand most of his language, but she listened, her silver eyes tracking every movement he made. He gave her food, warmth, a bed in the corner of the workshop where the smell of old engines always lingered. The first time she spoke, it was a single word in broken human tongue. Safe. It wasn't a question. It was a fragile hope. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. The scrap collector who never cared about anything suddenly found himself willing to risk everything. But the universe is never kind to secrets. The council had been monitoring signals around the scrap zone for months, waiting for traces of smuggled tech. They didn't expect a living alien. They didn't know that one of their most carefully erased species had survived in the shadows. But her kind, what little remained of them, were more dangerous than most humans understood. She carried a power inside her that had once made entire fleets kneel. She didn't know it yet, neither did he, but others did, and they were already coming. The first sign came with the drones. Small, black, silent, council probes sliding low through the mist. He watched them through the cracked window as she stood behind him, her hand gripping the back of his shirt. She was trembling again, but this time not from fear of him. She remembered them. He didn't ask what they'd done to her, but the look in her eyes told him enough. She hadn't escaped. She'd been discarded. And now they wanted their property back. He moved fast. Years of living outside the council's control had taught him how to disappear. He stripped his workshop down, gathered old weapons, hidden comm jammers, maps of tunnels no one remembered. She didn't speak as he worked, but she followed him step for step, learning through the silence. The first time he handed her a coat and told her to keep close, she hesitated like someone who had never been given the right to follow anyone before. But then she nodded. The night they left, the sky over the scrap zone was full of silent lights, council patrol craft sweeping the fog. He led her through forgotten tunnels, abandoned loading shafts, and wrecked train lines until the colony was far behind them. The drones searched, but they didn't find them. He had always been good at hiding, but he knew hiding wouldn't be enough this time. The council didn't lose things, and whatever she was, they wanted her badly. Days turned to weeks as they moved from one shelter to another. She grew stronger, her silver hair no longer dulled by dirt, her voice steadier with each word she learned. She began to laugh sometimes, softly, shyly, like someone who didn't remember what it felt like to be alive. And he found himself listening to that sound more than he wanted to admit. But he also began to notice the other thing, the way lights flickered when she got scared, the way old generators hummed around her like they were responding. She wasn't ordinary. She was dangerous in a way even she didn't understand. It wasn't long before the council sent real soldiers. They arrived without warning, silent landers in the night, boots on the ground, weapons that didn't miss. He and the girl were sitting near an old comm tower when the first searchlights cut through the dark. She froze, whispering something in her own language, her hands trembling. He grabbed her arm and ran. Plasma bolts ripped through the walls around them. He'd fought scavengers before, but these weren't scavengers. This was a retrieval team, and they didn't come to talk. They fought through the storm that night, weaving through the abandoned city like hunted animals. The soldiers didn't know him, didn't expect a human to resist. But humanity had always had a talent for making powerful enemies bleed. He hit them where it hurt: power relays, fuel lines, the dark corners of the streets they thought were empty. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't need to be. He was desperate, and desperation had built empires before. She watched him fight for her, and something changed in her eyes. She wasn't just afraid anymore. She cared. When they finally made it to the river, when the last explosion rolled through the ruins behind them, she clung to him like someone who'd found the only light left in the galaxy. Her voice shook as she whispered, "Stay with me." But safety didn't exist anymore. The council had marked them. And above the world, in the cold corridors of their warships, something far bigger was beginning to move. The Galactic Council didn't fear one man, but they feared what he was protecting. She wasn't just an abandoned alien girl. She was a living key to a weapon older than the Council itself. And now she wasn't just surviving. She was choosing him. The war began quietly. Drones disappearing, patrols failing to return, whispers spreading through the colonies about a human man and a silver-eyed alien girl who defied the Council. The galaxy had seen rebellions before, but not like this. Because this one started in the scrap zone. And it started with love. When the Council fleet finally descended, they expected to find two frightened fugitives. Instead, they found something else. Humanity had been listening, watching, waiting for a reason to rise again. And one man's choice to save a broken alien girl had just become that reason. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories. Your support helps bring these legends of humanity to life, one star at a time. The storm rolled in heavy the next night, cold rain drumming against rusted metal like fingers tapping a warning no one wanted to hear. The scrap zone lay quiet beneath the fog, piles of broken machines jutting out of the earth like the bones of a forgotten age. He walked carefully through the narrow paths he'd carved out over the years, the same routes scavengers used to avoid patrol drones. But this time he wasn't alone. She walked behind him in silence, her bare feet barely making a sound, the oversized coat swallowing her small frame. Her silver hair stuck to her cheeks, rain dripping down her pale skin. He kept glancing back, unsure if she'd keep following, unsure why she hadn't already vanished back into the shadows. But every time his eyes met hers, she flinched like someone who had learned not to trust, and yet didn't want to be alone. He didn't know what she was, but he knew what she wasn't. She wasn't like the other broken machines dumped here. She wasn't like the mindless scrap drones that sometimes crawled out of the junk heaps. Her eyes held something alive, something scared, something dangerous. He led her through a gap in the scrap wall and into the hidden shelter he'd built out of old transport containers, patched together with steel, stubbornness, and a lifetime of avoiding attention. The small heater buzzed faintly as he switched it on, the orange light casting warmth into the damp darkness. She stood near the door, dripping, trembling, looking around like someone who had never been inside a home before. He grabbed an old towel, tossed it toward her. She stared at it like it was a weapon at first, then slowly reached out and clutched it with both hands. She moved closer to the heater, the silver glow beneath her skin faint but steady, like something buried deep inside her. He couldn't ignore it anymore. "What are you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how. She looked at him with wide, wet eyes, opened her mouth, and a sound came out soft, like starlight breaking over water. Not words, a language not meant for human ears. He raised his hands, signaling he didn't understand. She blinked, then tried again, slowly, as if pulling human words out of a place where they didn't belong. Safe. It wasn't a question. It was a plea wrapped in a single fragile word. He nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. But the way her shoulders loosened just a little told him that single word was everything to her. She collapsed onto the floor beside the heater and fell asleep almost instantly, curled up like someone who had spent too long fighting to stay alive. He didn't sleep that night. He sat near the door, rifle across his lap, watching the rain wash over the scrap heaps outside. He'd lived a quiet, invisible life for years, keeping away from the Galactic Council's eyes, scavenging enough to eat, fighting only when he had to. But now, with this strange silver-eyed alien asleep in his shelter, that quiet was slipping through his fingers. Nothing that belonged to the Council ever stayed lost for long. And if they had thrown her away, it meant they wanted to erase her completely. That thought sat heavy in his chest. When morning came, she was awake before him, sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the small fire as if it was some great and terrible thing. When he offered her a piece of ration bread, she hesitated, sniffing it carefully before taking the smallest bite he'd ever seen. It made him laugh despite himself, a sound he hadn't heard from his own mouth in a long time. She tilted her head at the sound like it was something foreign. And in that small moment, something fragile and human formed between them. Not trust yet, but something close. But safety was a lie. It always had been in the scrap zone. The first sign of trouble came with the sound of engines. Distant, heavy, not scavenger trucks but something cleaner, sharper. Council drones. They hovered like carrion birds at the edge of the zone, their scanners sweeping the wreckage. He moved fast, yanking the curtain shut, cutting the heater. The warmth vanished, replaced by the old cold that had always lived in these walls. She looked at him, confused at first, but then she heard it too. Her glow dimmed, her body tensing as if every bone remembered the sound of those engines. He grabbed his pack and weapons without a word, and she followed like a shadow. He didn't have to explain. Her fear told him everything. They slipped through narrow paths between scrap mountains, moving like ghosts beneath the early morning fog. The drones hovered overhead, their red lights cutting through the gray like predator eyes. For years, he had survived by staying small, invisible. Now, with her, everything felt louder, brighter, more dangerous. They reached the lower levels of the zone, where old orbital pods and buried starship hulls sat half-sunk in the mud. Here, the air was heavier, the ground softer. The perfect place to hide, if you knew the way. He pressed her against the metal wall of a shattered freighter as a drone passed above. She didn't make a sound, but he felt her trembling against him. Not just fear, memory. She had been hunted before. He could feel it in the way her breathing shifted, in the way she stared at the drone like someone staring at their nightmare. When the sound faded, he finally let her breathe. They crouched in the hollow of an old escape bay, and he spoke low. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" She didn't answer, but the way her fingers gripped the edge of her coat told him everything he needed. She wasn't just some alien who had wandered into the wrong place. She was something the Council wanted to keep buried. That night, after they returned to the shelter, she sat by the heater again, her hands glowing faintly in the dark. He watched her for a long time. Every survival instinct he had screamed to walk away, to let the Council take her. But humans don't always follow instinct. Sometimes they follow something quieter, something stubborn. He remembered the way she had said, "safe," and he realized she'd chosen him, not because she thought he could fight the galaxy, but because he was the first person who hadn't left her behind. She whispered something in her language then, almost too soft to hear. He didn't understand, but he caught one word. Stay. And for the first time in a very long time, he said it back. Stay. Neither of them noticed the red lights blinking faintly in the distant fog. the drones hadn't left. They were tracking, watching, waiting, and far above the colony, the Galactic Council had already flagged their coordinates. The world he'd built around himself was crumbling. But the quiet scavenger had no idea that what he'd just done, taking in a silver-eyed girl, was about to set the stars on fire. The wind howled across the scrap zone that night like some great beast, rattling old metal and sweeping ash through the empty corridors of forgotten ships. The man had spent years learning to read those winds, to listen to their quiet warnings. They always spoke before danger came. This time, the wind carried the faint buzz of approaching engines. Council engines. Clean, precise, unmistakable. He tightened his grip on the old pulse rifle leaning against the wall and turned toward the corner of the shelter where she sat, wrapped in a blanket too big for her thin frame. Her silver hair caught the glow of the heater, her wide eyes staring at him as if she already knew what the sound meant. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She had lived with the council's shadow long before she met him. Her trembling hands and quick, shallow breaths told him she recognized that sound better than he ever could. She was shaking, not because of the cold, but because she had heard that song before. Right before someone tried to take her life. He knelt down in front of her, lowering his voice. "We have to go." She froze for a heartbeat, then nodded. No hesitation, no wasted words. She trusted him. That trust sat like a weight on his chest, heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. They moved fast through the narrow passageways between the scrap heaps, their footsteps drowned by the wind. He'd spent years building escape routes, digging holes in the galaxy's forgotten corners. No one survived out here without a plan. But tonight, the plan had changed. Tonight, he wasn't just running for himself. He was running for her. He led her down a thin, rust-stained staircase, through a hatch that dropped into the underbelly of a broken transport barge, its metal walls still echoing with the ghosts of some long-dead war. Above them, the drone swarm arrived. Silent, smooth, precise. The council didn't waste time with loud announcements or blinking lights. When they came for something, they came like a storm made of blades. The red glow of their scanners swept over the surface of the scrap zone, slicing through the fog in clean lines. He pressed her back against the cold steel wall, covering her with his body as two beams passed inches from their hiding place. She clutched the front of his coat with white knuckles, breathing fast, but she didn't make a sound. Not one. He had never seen anyone stay so still while drowning in fear. That was when it hit him. This wasn't the first time she had hidden from them like this. She'd done this before. Maybe many times. She had survived the hunters alone before he ever showed up. The thought made something twist inside him. Anger, cold and sharp. Not at her. At them. At the council that treated living beings like garbage to be dumped and retrieved when convenient. The drones didn't leave. They hovered low, sweeping the perimeter with their scanners, crawling through the silence like predators that had already caught the scent. He checked the old pulse detonators strapped to his belt. The odds were bad. They always were. But odds had never stopped humanity before. Humans didn't fight because they were stronger. They fought because they refused to stop. He took her hand, fingers cold against his, and whispered, "Stay close, no matter what happens." She nodded once, silver eyes bright against the darkness. They slipped into the forgotten tunnels beneath the scrap zone. Long-abandoned infrastructure that most scavengers didn't even know existed. The walls dripped with condensation, and the floor was slick with old oil and dirt. The hum of the drones grew louder behind them, bouncing off the tunnel walls. She squeezed his hand harder. He didn't tell her it would be fine. He didn't lie. He just kept moving, counting steps, remembering the twists and turns he had mapped over years of solitude. Halfway through the tunnel, the ceiling above them vibrated with a sound that made his blood run cold. Engines. Not the small, quiet engines of drones. Heavier, bigger, dropships. The council wasn't playing games anymore. This wasn't a retrieval team. This was a lockdown. She looked up, her face pale beneath the silver glow. "They found me," she whispered in a voice so soft it barely rose above the wind in the tunnel. There was no panic in her words, only the exhausted certainty of someone who had run too many times before. "Not yet," he said. They reached an access hatch leading up to the riverbed, a place where the wind howled loudest, masking the sound of footsteps. He kicked it open carefully and climbed out first, the rain hitting his face like shards of ice. She followed close, the oversized coat soaked through in seconds. He crouched low, pulling her behind a pile of rusted scrap, and watched as the first council ship descended through the storm. Its black hull cut through the clouds like a blade, engines glowing faint blue. Soldiers in armor fanned out with perfect formation, their visors reflecting the storm. He had seen council soldiers before. He had avoided them his entire life. But he had never seen them deploy this many for one target. That meant she was more than just another runaway. He glanced at her. Her eyes were locked on the soldiers, not with hatred, but with the numb recognition of someone who had escaped them before. The first drone caught their trail near the river. It dropped lower, scanner beam locking on. She flinched, a soft, pained sound escaping her throat like the air itself had turned sharp. He reacted before she could move, firing once with the pulse rifle. The shot was clean, and the drone exploded in a flash of red light. But the silence shattered with it. The soldiers turned in unison, weapons raised, and the chase began. They ran through the riverbed, mud splashing beneath their boots, searchlights slicing through the night. Plasma bolts cracked through the rain, scorching the water where they had been seconds earlier. He ducked behind a collapsed bridge, pulling her down with him as light exploded against the steel overhead. She was shaking, breathing hard, silver light beneath her skin pulsing fast. He grabbed her face gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. You are not going back to them. Not now. Not ever." Something changed in her expression then. The fear didn't vanish, but something steadier settled beneath it. A quiet, dangerous resolve. She took a breath, lifted her hands, and for the first time he saw a glimpse of what she really was. The light under her skin flared, bright and blinding, spilling out into the storm like liquid fire. The scanners stuttered, drones above flickered, and the soldiers, trained to control everything, suddenly faced something they didn't understand. The rain fell harder, thunder rolling above like the universe itself was holding its breath. This was no longer a simple hunt. This was the beginning of a storm that the Galactic Council would wish they hadn't started. Because they weren't just chasing a broken alien girl anymore. They were about to meet the one thing they never accounted for, human defiance. The rain came down in cold, hard sheets as the colony slept, but the scrap zone didn't sleep. It never did. Between the twisted metal towers and rotting starship carcasses, something was moving. A hunter convoy, silent and efficient, cutting through the fog like a blade. From the shadows, he watched their lights sweep across the junk fields. His jaw tight, pulse steady. This was the first time in years the Council had sent soldiers this deep into the zone. For a moment, he wondered if this was what his quiet life had always been leading toward. Then he looked at her, Leora, and knew the answer. She stood beside him in the tunnel mouth, wrapped in the same old coat, her silver hair plastered to her face from the mist. The faint glow beneath her skin pulsed faster when the first transport landed on the edge of the field. She didn't need to say anything. Her fear was a language he understood now. She'd run from these ships before. She knew what happened when they caught her kind. He tightened the strap on his rifle, adjusted the pack on his shoulder, and whispered the only thing that mattered. "We move." She nodded, silent but determined. They slipped through the shadows, feet splashing in shallow puddles, weaving through old starship bones. He had built these escape routes over years, mapping every weak spot, every crawl space, every blind angle. But this time, the game was different. The Council wasn't sending scavenger patrols or low-tier enforcers. They'd brought hunter units. He could hear their boots hitting the metal ground in clean formation, the kind of step that meant precision. These were killers. Leora stumbled once on the slick surface, and his hand shot back instinctively, catching hers before she fell. For a split second, she looked at him. Not with fear, but something softer. like she still couldn't believe someone would hold on instead of letting go. He didn't have time to think about what that meant. Engines roared overhead as the first drone swarm passed above them, beams cutting through the fog like hot knives. They ducked beneath the wing of an old freighter hull just as the beams swept their hiding spot. 1 second too slow and they'd have been ash. He led her down into the underlevels, a place no one visited anymore. A graveyard beneath a graveyard. The air was thick with oil and rust, and the floor was uneven with corroded panels. It was the kind of place only a scavenger would know. Perfect for disappearing. She followed close behind, her breathing quick, shallow, the faint silver glow at her throat flickering like a heartbeat. She whispered something in her language, a trembling sound that made his gut twist. It wasn't fear. It was memory. The tunnels shook a moment later. The council had started their sweep. Drones burst through the upper scrap levels like hornets, and searchlights flooded the streets above. He pressed her back against the cold wall, his own breath shallow, as a pair of hunters moved past the tunnel entrance. Their helmets cast pale blue light across the ground, sweeping in smooth arcs. They were close, too close. He tightened his grip on his rifle, ready to make it loud if he had to. But she did something he didn't expect. She raised a trembling hand and pressed it against the wall. The silver light beneath her skin spread out like liquid fire, moving through the metal itself. The scanners outside stuttered. The hunters paused mid-step, helmets flickering. She lowered her hand, gasping, sweat beading on her forehead. It had worked. For the first time, he saw a flash of what she really was. Not helpless, not weak. Something dangerous. Something the council clearly feared. They made it deeper into the lower tunnels just as the first hunter squad broke through the upper level. He knew these kinds of operations. The council never stopped once they had a trail. They would burn through this entire zone just to erase one life. That was the kind of empire they were. And if he stayed on the defensive, they'd eventually corner them. He moved to an old console built into the wall. One he'd rebuilt over the years for emergencies like this. He flipped switches, rerouted power lines. Old defense grids hummed to life, hidden under layers of rust and dirt. Automated turrets he'd salvaged from scrap blinked awake, their red targeting lights cutting through the dark. "They won't stop," Leora whispered, stepping closer, her voice shaking but strong. "They always find me." "Then we stop them first," he answered quietly. The hunters entered the tunnels 5 minutes later, and the scrap zone exploded into chaos. The air filled with the sound of gunfire and shattering metal. His turrets ripped through the first squad before they even knew what hit them. Drones tried to dive in from above, but the old magnetic pulse emitters he'd built years ago fried them midair. He fought like someone who'd spent his life preparing for a fight no one thought would come. Leora stood in the shadows behind him, watching the storm with wide, bright eyes. She'd spent so long running she'd forgotten what it looked like when someone fought for her instead of against her. When the second squad pushed forward, one of them spotted her. A shot rang out. He didn't even think. He moved, slamming into her and shoving her behind cover as plasma seared the air. He fired back, clean and quick, dropping the soldier with a shot between the visor plates. The fight spilled out into the storm above, rain mixing with the glow of burning metal. He could see more dropships landing in the distance. The council wasn't playing anymore. They wanted her back, or they wanted her dead. She stood beside him in the rain now, not hiding this time. Her silver light burned brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat across the darkened scrapyard. Drones turned toward her, scanners flickering as their systems tried to process what they were seeing. And then she raised both hands. The light that erupted from her wasn't a weapon he recognized. It wasn't human. It was alive, like the stars themselves had cracked open. Every drone froze midair. Every scanner glitched into static, and a wave of invisible force rolled across the zone like a storm front. The soldiers faltered for the first time, and in their hesitation he struck. When the last of the first wave fell, the zone was quiet except for the rain hitting the smoldering wreckage. She was breathing hard, silver light dimming again, but she was still standing. He walked to her slowly, rain dripping off his coat, rifle hanging loose at his side. Her eyes met his, not with fear this time, but something steadier. Something that scared him more than any council soldier. Trust. Far above them, in the cold corridors of a council warship, an officer stared at the readings on his console. One human, one alien girl, a dozen hunters down, drones offline, a faint, unknown energy signature spiking across the sector. His hands trembled as he sent the signal to the fleet. Reinforcements were coming. And for the first time in years, he wasn't just a scavenger trying to survive in the shadows. He was a threat. A single human standing between the Galactic Council and something they wanted buried forever. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The rain never stopped that night. It came down harder than before, soaking the wreckage and turning the ground into a river of black mud. Smoke still curled from the ruins where the hunter squads had fallen, and the smell of scorched metal clung to the air like a warning. He stood at the edge of the clearing, the rifle heavy in his hands, staring at the dark horizon. Leora sat on a rusted container behind him, wrapped in the old coat, her glowing wrists dim but steady, her breathing still rough from the power she'd unleashed. Her light had faded, but he could still feel the echo of it in the air, like static crawling over his skin. He had fought before, small fights, dirty ones, against scavengers, raiders, the odd council patrol. But nothing like this, nothing that felt this big. Tonight hadn't been a random skirmish. This was a line being drawn. The council wouldn't let this pass. They couldn't. When they sent a hunter team and it didn't come back, they escalated. He'd seen it before in other sectors. First came the cleanup squads. Then came the warships. Then entire towns disappeared from the map. And this time it wasn't a town they were after. It was her. Leora sat silently, her silver eyes following the rain as it streaked across the metal ground. She didn't have to ask what was coming next. She already knew. He could see it in the way she held herself, like someone who had been through this cycle more than once. Someone who had lost everything before and had stopped expecting a way out. But something was different this time. She wasn't alone anymore. He crouched down in front of her, wiping the rain from his face. "They'll bring more," he said quietly. "A lot more." Her lips trembled as she whispered, "They always do." He wanted to tell her they would run, that they could hide. But the truth was the council didn't lose people. Not like this. And after what they had seen of her power, they wouldn't risk losing her again. He had bought them time, but time was short. He stood and turned toward the old factory at the far end of the scrap field. He'd spent years building traps, digging defenses, preparing for enemies who never came. Tonight, every piece of that preparation would finally matter. If the council was coming, then they were going to have to fight through everything he'd ever built. Leora followed him inside, her footsteps soft on the wet metal floor. The factory was a skeleton of what it once was, a maze of old machines, storage crates, and scaffolding. But beneath the surface, hidden from anyone who didn't know where to look, he had carved a network of tunnels and command points. He had rigged the walls with EMP mines, set up auto turrets, and scavenged power cores to keep it all alive. For years, everyone thought he was just a quiet scrap collector with nothing but rust and shadows. But the truth was, he'd been preparing for a war he hoped would never come. She stopped in the middle of the room, staring at the control table he'd built from salvaged parts. "You planned this," she whispered. "Not for this," he answered honestly, checking the charge on one of the rifles. "But for something like it." She tilted her head, her silver hair clinging to her cheeks. "Why?" He paused, then gave her the only truth that mattered. "Because one day, someone always comes." Outside, the sky began to change. The clouds split apart, not from wind or rain, but from the burn of engines. The sound reached them seconds later, a deep, bone-shaking roar that made the walls tremble. He stepped outside with her beside him and saw them through the rain. Massive council gunships breaking through the storm, black hulls gleaming, formation tight. This wasn't a sweep. This was a siege. Her breath hitched, the light beneath her skin flickering like a frightened pulse. "They'll burn it all," she whispered. Then we make it hurt, he said calmly. The gunships hovered over the scrap zone, releasing a second wave of hunter squads, heavier than before, armored soldiers with cold precision. Drones fanned out in perfect formation. They had numbers. They had technology. But they didn't have surprise anymore. He triggered the first layer of traps as soon as they touched down. The ground erupted in a series of concussive blasts, throwing soldiers and drones into the air. Turrets hidden beneath scrap heaps sprang to life, tearing through the front line with blinding light. Hunters scrambled for cover, shouting in their guttural language as the rain turned red with sparks and smoke. She stood behind him in the doorway of the factory, clutching the fabric of his coat. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was watching. He fought like someone who had nothing left to lose. Years of surviving in the gutters of the galaxy had taught him where to shoot, when to move, how to make every bullet count. The Council soldiers advanced with cold efficiency, but they weren't expecting a fight like this from one human. Explosions tore through their formation, slowing their push. Drones dropped from the air as the old magnetic pulse traps he'd buried years ago triggered one after another. But the Council didn't care about losses. They were relentless. For every wave he cut down, two more appeared. The ground shook as a massive dropship touched down near the edge of the zone, heavier than anything he'd seen before. That wasn't just a transport. That was a command unit. She saw it too. Her glowing wrists pulsed faster, fear rising in her chest like a storm. "They'll take me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They'll kill you." He looked back at her then, rain running down his face, and for a moment, the chaos outside didn't exist. "Then they'll have to go through me first." The dropship doors opened, and the Real hunters stepped out. Not soldiers, enforcers, the kind sent when the Council wanted something over. Their black armor glistened with rain as they moved forward in perfect formation, their rifles humming with the low, deadly whine of fully charged plasma. He triggered the second wave of defenses. More explosions ripped through the battlefield. Walls of fire and steel erupted between them. But the enforcers didn't flinch. They pushed forward, cutting through the wreckage like wolves through dry grass. She stepped out of the factory then, rain soaking her hair, silver light blazing beneath her skin. She wasn't running this time. She wasn't begging. She walked toward the edge of the clearing, past him, her bare feet splashing through the mud. The enforcers slowed for the first time, their visors flashing as their scanners tried to process the energy readings coming off her body. The air shifted. The rain seemed to pause midair. Then the light beneath her skin flared, brighter than any fire he'd ever seen. Every drone in the sky shorted out at once. The enforcers froze as their weapons sputtered and died. The dropship behind them groaned as its engines whined in protest. Her voice rang out across the battlefield, not in human language, but in something old and beautiful and terrifying. And the storm answered. He watched her. Not the scared girl he'd found in the trash, but something far greater, something the Council had tried to erase. She turned to look at him once, just for a heartbeat, and in that look was everything. Trust, fear, hope. The enforcers raised their weapons again, but this time, the ground itself trembled. She had found her strength, and with it she made the hunters bleed. The storm had begun. The galaxy was watching now whether it wanted to or not, and somewhere deep inside him, something he thought long dead began to burn. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was war. The night sky burned, not with fire, but with the cold, terrible light of warships blotting out the stars. The rain was still falling, but it couldn't drown the sound of engines that shook the earth beneath the scrap zone. The first wave had failed. The second had been torn apart. Now the Council was done pretending. They were sending everything. Massive carriers hovered low in the clouds, their dark hulls flashing with the pulse of charging cannons, their spotlights tearing through the storm like the eyes of predators. This wasn't a retrieval anymore. This was an erasure. He stood in the mud, breathing hard, soaked to the bone, his hands raw from fighting and building and bleeding. The rifle in his grip was burned hot, its barrel darkened from constant fire. His traps were still holding in some sectors, But the drones were adapting, their movements sharper, their formations shifting like a machine learning to hunt. He could hear the new wave of enforcers marching in perfect rhythm, an iron heartbeat cutting through the chaos. Leora stood at the center of the field, barefoot, her silver light brighter than the storm itself. Her hair clung to her face, her body trembling from the energy she'd poured into the fight. But her eyes were steady now, not frightened anymore, focused. She had spent her whole life running, hiding in the cracks of a galaxy that had no mercy for her kind. But this night was different. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was choosing to stand. And he was choosing to stand with her. The next volley came without warning. A gunship banked low over the wreckage and unleashed a blast that ripped through one of his barricades like paper. The explosion flung both of them backward, shards of hot metal raining down around them. He hit the mud hard, lungs burning, ears ringing. Leora fell beside him, coughing, her light flickering weakly. He rolled onto his side, dragging her behind the twisted skeleton of an old cargo hauler, just as another blast scorched the ground where they had been seconds before. He was out of time, out of ammunition, and out of places to run. But he wasn't out of defiance. Not yet. He forced himself up, his hands shaking but steady enough to reload the last of his power cells. He could see them now through the smoke, the enforcers advancing in a perfect line, their armor gleaming black under the floodlights, their visors reflecting her silver glow. Behind them, a new figure stepped out of the dropship. Tall, still, cloaked in the insignia of the council itself. A handler, not a soldier. Commander, return the asset. The handler's voice boomed through the rain, cold and without a trace of life. Do so, and your death will be swift. Resist, and your species will suffer. His fingers tightened on the rifle. She's not an asset, he growled. The handler tilted its head, voice unchanging. Everything is an asset. Leora pushed herself up slowly, standing beside him, weak but unbroken. Her glowing wrists pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She was shaking, not from fear but from the sheer force of holding herself upright. She looked at him, rain dripping down her cheeks like tears that weren't there. You should leave, she whispered, her voice so soft it almost drowned in the storm. He looked back at her, face bruised, breath ragged, and still managed to smile. I don't leave people behind. The handler raised one gloved hand, and the enforcers surged forward like a black tide. Plasma fire lit up the night, beams tearing through the storm. He moved first, firing with practiced precision, cutting down the front ranks, using every inch of the battlefield he'd prepared. Mines detonated, smoke filled the air, but the council kept coming. Leora closed her eyes. The light beneath her skin flared again, flooding the field with a glow so bright the rain seemed to scatter around it. She raised her hands, and the air trembled as a pulse rolled out from her like a wave, hitting the enforcers head-on. Their weapons sputtered and died, their visors cracked with static, and their perfect march faltered for the first time. She gasped, the force tearing through her, but she didn't stop. He charged forward through the chaos, rifle blazing, turning every trap and turret he'd ever built into a storm of metal. The hunters had numbers, but he had desperation, and desperation was something humanity had always been good at turning into fire. The handler didn't flinch. It raised its own weapon, a black staff glowing with council energy, and stepped into the light. One sweep of the weapon sent a surge of plasma ripping through the mud, throwing him backward, smashing him into the side of a broken freighter. Pain tore through his body like fire, but he forced himself up, teeth gritted, vision swimming. The handler moved toward Leora, calm as death. You were never meant to be anything, it said in its cold, perfect voice. You were meant to disappear. But she wasn't disappearing. She was shining. Her light burned so bright now it lit up the whole field like a star, cutting through the fog and rain. For the first time, the enforcers hesitated. For the first time, the handler stepped back. And then the sky split open. A massive ripple tore through the clouds, scattering the storm like dust. A fleet emerged, dark, sleek, and burning with an energy the council didn't control. Unknown ships. Dozens of them. Leora's eyes widened as she staggered, clutching her chest. She felt it before anyone else did. This wasn't the council. This was the answer to the signal she had sent. Someone had heard her cry. Someone had come. Council comms erupted in static. The handler turned its gaze upward, its perfect confidence cracking for the first time. The newcomers' ships formed a perfect line across the clouds, their hulls humming with power. The sky wasn't quiet anymore. It was roaring. The handler shouted orders. Enforcers regrouped. But the man was already moving, pushing through the pain, grabbing Leora's hand, and dragging her toward the high ground near the old control tower. This was their chance, not just to survive but to end it. Above them, the fleets collided in a storm of light. Beams tore through the clouds, burning like suns. Explosions shook the earth as council ships met an enemy they hadn't prepared for. And on the ground, in the mud and rain, two figures stood shoulder to shoulder against the black tide. She looked at him, tears mixing with rain. "Why?" she whispered. "Why fight for me?" He exhaled, steady and quiet. "Because that's what humans do." The enforcers came one last time, but they came into a storm they couldn't control. Her power erupted like a second dawn, colliding with their weapons, turning their formation into chaos. He fought beside her, not as a soldier, but as something older, a human standing between a monster and someone who needed him. When the smoke cleared, the handler lay broken in the mud, the fleet above burning like dying stars, and the rain finally began to ease. The council had not expected to bleed here, but they had. And somewhere in that broken silence, a legend was born. She fell against him, exhausted, her light fading to a soft glow. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her steady as the distant rumble of the Allied fleet echoed overhead. For the first time since the night he found her in the trash, she wasn't running. She was safe. He looked up at the sky, the last council ship retreating into the void, and knew nothing would ever be the same. Humanity had stood against an empire, and the galaxy had seen it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories. Your support keeps humanity's legends alive. And this was just the beginning.